Marcus Deshaun Williams stood motionless in the Cook County courtroom as the judge read out a sentence that would echo through Chicago's legal history. 540 years in prison for the systematic execution of 7 members of his extended family. The massacre had occurred on a frigid January night in 2021, transforming a modest Southside home into a crime scene that would haunt even the most seasoned homicide detectives. Williams had entered his cousin's residence armed with 2 handguns and methodically moved through the house, shooting each victim at close range while they gathered for what was supposed to be a celebration of his aunt's 60th birthday. The victims ranged in age from 19 to 62, representing 3 generations of the Williams-Jackson family, a close-knit clan that had weathered Chicago's economic decline and violence together, only to be destroyed from within by one of their own. Before we continue with this devastating crime case, I'd like to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light, ensuring that victims' voices are heard and justice is remembered. The Williams-Jackson family had deep roots in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood, a historically significant area that had been the heart of the city's African-American community during the Great Migration. The family home, a 3-story brick building on South Indiana Avenue, had been purchased by patriarch James Jackson in 1968, just months after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination had sparked riots across the city. Through decades of urban renewal, white flight, economic transformation, and the crack epidemic of the 80s, the Jackson family had maintained their residence, becoming pillars of a community that desperately needed stability and positive role models. Marcus Deshaun Williams grew up 3 blocks away from the Jackson family home, raised by his single mother, Patricia Williams, who worked double shifts as a nurse's aide to provide for Marcus and his younger sister. Marcus's father had been incarcerated when Marcus was 4 years old, serving a lengthy sentence for armed robbery, leaving Patricia to navigate parenthood alone in one of Chicago's most challenging neighborhoods. Despite his mother's efforts, Marcus struggled throughout his childhood, displaying behavioral problems that school counselors attributed to absent father syndrome and the trauma of growing up surrounded by violence. His academic performance declined steadily through middle school, and by high school Marcus had fallen in with a street crew affiliated with the Gangster Disciples, one of Chicago's most notorious gangs. His juvenile record included arrests for theft, vandalism, and assault, though most charges were reduced or dismissed due to lack of evidence and overcrowded juvenile detention facilities. The connection between Marcus and the Jackson family ran through his mother Patricia, whose sister Lorraine had married James Jackson in 1985. This marriage made the Jacksons Marcus's aunt and uncle by marriage, and despite the family's concerns about Marcus's increasingly troubled behavior, they never turned their backs on Patricia's son. James Jackson, a retired postal worker who had served in Vietnam, made repeated attempts to mentor Marcus, inviting him to family gatherings and trying to provide the male guidance that Marcus's father could not. Lorraine Jackson, the matriarch whose birthday celebration would become the setting for the massacre, worked as a teacher's aide at a local elementary school and was known throughout the neighborhood for her generous spirit and willingness to help struggling families. The Jacksons had raised 3 children, twins Darnell and Danielle, both 38 at the time of the murders, and their younger son Jerome, who was 34. All 3 had remained close to their parents, frequently visiting the family home that held so many memories of birthdays, holidays, and Sunday dinners. The fracture between Marcus and the Jackson family began in 2019, when Darnell Jackson discovered that Marcus had stolen his identity to open credit cards and take out a small personal loan. The fraud had damaged Darnell's credit significantly, jeopardizing his ability to purchase a home with his wife and 2 children. When confronted, Marcus initially denied the theft, then offered a half-hearted apology that included no attempt at restitution or acknowledgement of the harm he had caused. Darnell, who worked as an accountant and had built his financial reputation through years of careful planning, reported the identity theft to police, resulting in Marcus's arrest and conviction on fraud charges. The conviction carried a 3-year probation sentence and a restitution order requiring Marcus to repay approximately $18,000 to his cousin and the financial institutions he had defrauded. This legal action created a permanent rift in the family, with Marcus viewing Darnell's decision to involve law enforcement as the ultimate betrayal, while the Jackson family saw Marcus's theft as a violation of trust that could not be overlooked simply because they were related. Marcus's resentment toward the Jackson family deepened during his probation period, when multiple family members testified in court about additional incidents that painted a pattern of manipulative and predatory behavior. Jerome Jackson revealed that Marcus had borrowed $5,000 2 years earlier under the pretense of starting a business, money that was never repaid and apparently spent on drugs and gambling. Danielle Jackson testified about Marcus showing up at her workplace demanding money and becoming verbally aggressive when she refused, behavior that had forced her to file a restraining order that was still active at the time of the murders. Most damaging was testimony from Lorraine Jackson herself, who described finding Marcus stealing jewelry from her bedroom during a family gathering, confronting him, and being threatened with violence if she told anyone. These testimonies, delivered by family members in a public courtroom, humiliated Marcus and transformed his anger into something darker and more calculated. He began making cryptic statements on social media about family loyalty and the consequences of betrayal, posts that would later be analyzed by forensic psychologists as evidence of his deteriorating mental state and growing fixation on revenge. The city of Chicago, with its complex history of segregation, violence, and resilience, formed an appropriate backdrop for this story of family destruction. The South Side neighborhood where the Jackson family lived had seen its share of tragedy, with shootings and gang violence claiming young lives with disturbing regularity. Yet the Jackson family represented something different, a stable, law-abiding clan that believed in education, hard work, and community involvement. James Jackson served on the Neighborhood Watch Committee and had organized youth basketball leagues to keep kids off the streets. Lorraine volunteered at the local food pantry and tutored children struggling with reading. Their children had all graduated from college, a significant achievement in a community where educational attainment often fell victim to poverty and systemic inequality. The family's commitment to their neighborhood made the massacre even more shocking to residents who had looked to the Jacksons as examples of what families could achieve despite the challenges surrounding them. Marcus Williams spent the 18 months following his fraud conviction in a downward spiral of unemployment, drug use, and increasing isolation from the few friends and family members who had tried to maintain contact. His mother, Patricia, watched helplessly as her son descended into paranoia and rage, frequently ranting about how the Jackson family had destroyed his life and reputation. Patricia would later testify that she had urged Marcus to seek mental health treatment, even offering to pay for therapy. But Marcus refused, insisting that he didn't need help and that everyone else was the problem. His social media posts during this period revealed a man consumed by grievance and victimhood, constantly posting about family betrayal, systemic injustice, and the need for people to face consequences for their actions. In one particularly chilling post made just 3 weeks before the murders, Marcus wrote, "Some debts can't be paid with money. Some people need to understand that destroying someone has a price." Friends who saw the post assumed he was being dramatic, engaging in the kind of vague, threatening rhetoric common on social media. None reported the post to authorities or recognized it as a genuine warning of impending violence. The planning phase of Marcus Williams's attack demonstrated a level of premeditation that would later prove crucial to the prosecution's case for first-degree murder charges. Evidence recovered from his apartment revealed that Marcus had been surveilling the Jackson family home for at least 3 weeks before the murders, documenting the family's routines, photographing visitors coming and going, and noting when the house was most likely to contain multiple family members. He had researched silencers online, viewed videos about executing mass shootings efficiently, and studied cases of family annihilators, seemingly looking for tactical guidance from other domestic terrorists. Most disturbing was a handwritten document found in his bedroom that investigators characterized as a hit list, containing the names of all 7 eventual victims, alongside notes about their daily schedules and habits. The document also contained Marcus's justifications for targeting each person. Next to Darnell's name was written, D. Destroyed my credit and my future. Next to Lorraine's name was called me a thief in front of everyone. and next to Jerome's name was cited with Darnell, abandoned family loyalty. Marcus had acquired 2 firearms in the months before the massacre, both purchased legally despite his criminal record, because his fraud conviction was not classified as a violent felony under Illinois law. This loophole in the state's gun regulations would later become a point of controversy, with gun control advocates arguing that Marcus's purchase demonstrated the need for more comprehensive background checks that considered patterns of antisocial behavior beyond violent crime convictions. The weapons, a 9mm Glock 19 and a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson, were both purchased from licensed dealers in neighboring Indiana, where gun laws were significantly less restrictive than in Illinois. Marcus had also obtained a homemade suppressor through an associate connected to his former gang affiliations, a crude but functional device that would muffle the gunshots enough to avoid immediate detection by neighbors. The tactical preparation extended to Marcus purchasing dark clothing without identifying logos, latex gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, and a large duffel bag to transport his weapons and supplies to the crime scene. January 15th, 2021 was Lorraine Jackson's 60th birthday, a milestone the family had been planning to celebrate for months. The gathering at the family home on South Indiana Avenue was intended to be an intimate affair, with just immediate family members attending due to COVID-19 pandemic restrictions that were still in effect at the time. The guest list included Lorraine and James Jackson, their 3 adult children Darnell, Danielle and Jerome, Darnell's wife Monica, and the twins' 19-year-old cousin Tasha, who had been living with the Jacksons while attending community college. The family had ordered soul food from Lorraine's favorite restaurant, purchased a custom birthday cake from a local bakery known for its elaborate designs, and decorated the living room with balloons and streamers. Photographs taken earlier in the evening showed the family smiling, laughing, and celebrating together, completely unaware that these would be the last images ever captured of them alive. The joy and love evident in those pictures would later be displayed in court, offering a devastating contrast to the crime scene photos that documented their deaths. Marcus Williams arrived at the Jackson family home at approximately 8:45 p.m., parking his mother's borrowed Chevy Impala 3 blocks away to avoid having the vehicle identified near the crime scene. Security camera footage from a nearby convenience store captured Marcus walking toward the Jackson residence at 8:52 p.m., wearing dark clothing and carrying the large duffel bag that contained his weapons and tactical supplies. He had sent his mother a text message earlier that evening, claiming he was meeting friends for dinner, a lie that Patricia would discover only after her son had committed mass murder and destroyed what remained of their family. Marcus approached the Jackson house from the rear, cutting through an alley that provided access to the backyard, a route he had practiced during his surveillance period. The back door, which the family typically kept locked, had been left open to allow guests to step outside for fresh air, a small oversight that provided Marcus with easy access to the house without forcing entry or alerting the family to his presence. The birthday celebration was in full swing when Marcus entered through the back door, his weapons already drawn and ready. He moved through the kitchen silently, his approach masked by music playing in the living room where the family had gathered to sing happy birthday to Lorraine. Marcus's first victim was Tasha Williams, the 19-year-old cousin who had been in the kitchen preparing coffee for dessert. Forensic evidence would later show that Tasha was shot once in the back of the head at close range, the suppressed gunshot producing a sound quiet enough that it went unnoticed by the family members in the adjacent room. Tasha collapsed behind the kitchen island, her body discovered later in a pool of blood, still wearing the bright yellow dress she had chosen for the celebration. The young woman had been studying nursing with dreams of becoming a pediatric specialist, her life full of promise and potential that ended in an instant because she happened to be in the wrong place when Marcus began his rampage. Marcus moved from the kitchen into the dining room, where James Jackson was slicing birthday cake at the table. The 72-year-old Vietnam veteran, whose military service had taught him to recognize danger, turned at the sound of Marcus's approach and immediately understood what was happening. James attempted to charge at Marcus despite being unarmed, trying to tackle his nephew and prevent him from reaching the rest of the family in the living room. The struggle was brief, ending when Marcus fired 3 shots into James's chest at point-blank range, the force of the impacts driving the older man backward into the dining room wall where he slid to the floor, leaving a smear of blood that crime scene technicians would later document.
James Jackson died trying to protect his family.
His final act one of selfless courage that bought his wife and children precious seconds, though not enough time to escape or mount an effective defense against an armed attacker who had planned this assault meticulously. The sound of the struggle in the dining room alerted the remaining family members that something was wrong, but the confusion about what was happening cost them critical seconds that might have allowed some to escape or call for help. Jerome Jackson, who had been standing near the living room entrance, moved toward the dining room to investigate and found himself face to face with Marcus, who shot him twice in the chest before Jerome could speak or react. Jerome stumbled backward into the living room, collapsing near the couch where his mother Lorraine sat frozen in shock, unable to process the nightmare unfolding before her eyes. Danielle Jackson, Jerome's twin sister, screamed and attempted to run toward the front door. But Marcus tracked her movement and fired 3 shots, 2 of which struck Danielle in the back as she desperately tried to reach the exit. She fell just feet from the door that might have provided escape, her final moments spent trying to flee her own cousin's murderous rampage. Darnell Jackson, the cousin whose decision to report identity theft had triggered Marcus's obsessive need for revenge, attempted to fight back despite having no weapon. He grabbed a heavy lamp from a side table and charged at Marcus, managing to strike him once on the shoulder before Marcus shot him 4 times in rapid succession. Darnell's wife Monica, paralyzed by fear and horror, watched her husband die before Marcus turned the gun on her, shooting her twice in the head with cold efficiency. Lorraine Jackson, the matriarch whose birthday celebration had become a massacre, sat on the couch screaming for Marcus to stop, pleading with him to remember that they were family, that she loved him, that whatever had happened between them could be resolved without more violence. Her pleas fell on deaf ears as Marcus approached his aunt, the woman who had helped raise him after his father's incarceration, and shot her once in the forehead at close range, silencing her forever and completing his methodical execution of 7 people who had committed no crime other than existing as obstacles to his distorted sense of justice and wounded pride. The entire massacre lasted approximately 6 minutes, from the moment Marcus shot Tasha in the kitchen to the final shot that killed Lorraine in the living room. Marcus then moved through the house systematically, collecting shell casings to remove evidence and checking each victim to ensure they were dead. Security footage from neighbors' cameras later showed Marcus leaving the Jackson residence at 9:08 p.m., walking calmly back toward his parked car as if he had simply attended a normal family gathering. He drove directly to his apartment on the west side, approximately 40 minutes away, stopping once at a McDonald's drive-thru where surveillance cameras captured him, ordering food with no visible signs of stress or distress. This behavior, demonstrating his complete emotional detachment immediately after committing 7 murders, would later be cited by forensic psychiatrists as evidence of antisocial personality disorder with psychopathic features, a diagnosis that helped explain Marcus's capacity for such extreme violence against his own family without apparent remorse. The bodies were discovered at 10:35 p.m., when Lorraine's best friend Shirley Matthews arrived at the house expecting to join the birthday celebration, only to find the front door slightly ajar and no response to her knocking or calling out. Shirley pushed the door open and immediately saw Danielle Jackson's body lying in the entryway, prompting her to scream and run back to her car to call 911. The recording of Shirley's emergency call captured her hysteria and confusion as she tried to explain to the dispatcher what she had seen while avoiding entering the house where a potential attacker might still be present. Multiple police units responded within minutes, establishing a perimeter around the Jackson residence and entering with weapons drawn to search for survivors or an active shooter. What they found inside the Southside home would haunt these first responders for years afterward. 7 bodies scattered throughout 3 rooms, blood spatter on walls and furniture, and the lingering smell of gunpowder mixed with birthday cake and soul food. A grotesque juxtaposition of celebration and carnage that several officers would later cite as the worst crime scene they had encountered in their careers. Chicago Police Department. Homicide Detective Maria Santos arrived at the Jackson residence at 11:15 p.m., her 10th year with the unit having prepared her for horrific crime scenes, but nothing quite like the systematic family annihilation she now faced. Santos, who had grown up on the South Side herself and understood the tight-knit nature of these communities, recognized immediately that this was not a typical Chicago shooting resulting from gang activity or drug disputes. The tactical nature of the killings, the lack of forced entry, and the deliberate execution-style shots suggested a perpetrator who knew the victims and had planned the attack carefully. Detective Santos established a command center in the Jacksons' front yard, coordinating with crime scene investigators, the medical examiner's office, and additional detectives as news of the mass murder spread through the department. The magnitude of 7 victims murdered in a single incident made this one of the deadliest mass shootings in Chicago's recent history, a city already plagued by gun violence but relatively unaccustomed to family annihilations of this scale. Crime scene technicians worked through the night documenting evidence, photographing the victims' positions, collecting shell casings that Marcus had missed during his cleanup attempt, and gathering DNA samples from blood spatter patterns that would later prove crucial to establishing the sequence of murders. The house itself told the story of the massacre through physical evidence. Bullet holes in walls showing trajectories that helped reconstruct the shooter's movements, overturned furniture indicating brief struggles, and the birthday celebration decorations still hanging cheerfully despite the horror that had unfolded beneath them. Medical examiner Dr. Kenneth Harris conducted preliminary examinations of the bodies at the scene before authorizing their transport to the Cook County morgue for complete autopsies. Dr. Harris noted that all victims had been shot at close range with what appeared to be 2 different caliber weapons, suggesting the killer had been well armed and prepared for extended violence. The precision of the headshots on several victims indicated either military or gang training, someone comfortable with firearms and capable of executing accurate shots under stress. Detective Santos began building a suspect list by interviewing neighbors who had been home during the shooting, though most reported hearing nothing unusual due to the suppressed gunshots that Marcus had used. One neighbor, elderly widow Mrs. Florence Thompson, who lived directly next door, mentioned seeing a young man in dark clothing walking through the alley behind the Jackson house around 8:45 p.m., though she could not provide a detailed description of his face or build. Another neighbor reported seeing an unfamiliar Chevy Impala parked on the street 3 blocks away, noting it because the driver had sat in the car for several minutes before walking toward the Jackson residence. These fragments of witness testimony provided Santos with a starting point, though she knew that solving this case would require determining who had both motive and access to the victims, a combination that typically pointed towards someone within the family or close social circle. The breakthrough came when Detective Santos interviewed Patricia Williams, Marcus's mother, who had become concerned when her son failed to return her car by midnight as promised. Patricia revealed the family connection between Marcus and the Jacksons, immediately prompting Santos to investigate whether Marcus might have been at the birthday celebration. When Patricia mentioned that Marcus had been deeply resentful toward the Jackson family following his fraud conviction, and had made increasingly concerning statements about revenge and consequences, Santos's instincts told her she had identified her primary suspect. A background check revealed Marcus's criminal history, his probation status, and most importantly, his recent legal firearm purchases that matched the calibers used in the murders. Detective Santos obtained a search warrant for Marcus Williams's apartment and issued a be-on-lookout alert for him and his mother's Chevy Impala, suspecting that Marcus might attempt to flee Chicago once he realized police had identified him as a suspect. Officers conducting surveillance at Marcus's West Side apartment complex observed the Chevy Impala parked in its assigned space at 6:30 a.m. on January 16th, approximately 8 hours after the murders. Rather than immediately executing the arrest warrant, Detective Santos positioned a tactical team around the building and waited for Marcus to emerge, hoping to take him into custody without the risk of a barricade situation or hostage scenario that might result in additional casualties. Marcus exited his apartment at 7:45 a.m., dressed casually as if preparing for a normal day, his demeanor calm and unhurried as he walked toward his mother's car. The tactical team moved in swiftly, surrounding Marcus with weapons drawn and ordering him to the ground. Marcus complied without resistance, his expression showing neither surprise nor concern, as if he had expected this moment and accepted it as inevitable. Officers handcuffed him and conducted a protective search, finding no weapons on his person but recovering a cell phone that would later yield crucial evidence about his planning and movements on the night of the murders. The search of Marcus Williams's apartment produced overwhelming evidence of premeditation and intent. Detectives discovered the hit list with all 7 victims' names, surveillance photographs of the Jackson family home taken from various angles, internet search history revealing research into mass shootings and silencer construction, and receipts for the firearms purchased in Indiana. Most damning was a journal found hidden beneath Marcus's mattress, containing detailed entries describing his growing rage toward the Jackson family and his fantasies about making them pay for their betrayal. One entry dated January 10th, just 5 days before the murders, read, "Lorraine's birthday is coming. They'll all be together. This is my chance to make them understand what they took from me. They think calling the police and testifying against me had no consequences. They're about to learn different." The journal never explicitly stated that Marcus intended to commit murder, but the clear planning toward a violent confrontation on the specific date of the massacre left little doubt about his intentions and mental state. Forensic examination of Patricia Williams's Chevy Impala yielded additional evidence connecting Marcus to the crime scene. Traces of gunshot residue were found on the driver's seat and steering wheel, indicating Marcus had been handling firearms shortly before or during the time he drove the vehicle. More significantly, investigators discovered a small amount of blood on the car's floor mat that DNA analysis later matched to victim James Jackson, suggesting Marcus had stepped in his uncle's blood during the massacre and tracked minute amounts to his mother's car. Security camera footage from the convenience store near the Jackson home provided visual confirmation of Marcus walking toward the residence at the time of the murders, though his face was partially obscured by a hood, making absolute identification challenging without additional corroborating evidence. Traffic cameras captured the Chevy Impala, leaving the neighborhood approximately 20 minutes after the last victim was killed. The vehicle's license plate clearly visible and registered to Patricia Williams, establishing both presence and timing that aligned perfectly with the massacre timeline. Marcus Williams' interrogation began at Chicago Police Headquarters at 10:30 a.m. on January 16th, with Detective Maria Santos and her partner, Detective Raymond Porter, conducting the questioning in a Stark interview room equipped with audio and video recording equipment. After being read his Miranda rights, Marcus invoked his right to remain silent and requested an attorney, effectively ending any possibility of obtaining a confession or statement about his involvement in the murders. His demeanor during the brief interaction before requesting counsel was notable for its complete lack of emotional response. No nervousness, no defensive posturing, no apparent concern about the serious charges he faced. Detective Santos would later testify that Marcus appeared almost bored during the process, as if being arrested for 7 murders was merely an inconvenience rather than a life-altering event. This flat effect and absence of normal, emotional responses would become central to the prosecution's characterization of Marcus as a cold-blooded killer, incapable of empathy or remorse. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office moved swiftly to charge Marcus Williams with 7 counts of first-degree murder, each carrying a potential sentence of life imprisonment under Illinois law. Lead prosecutor David Chen, a veteran trial attorney with extensive experience in death penalty cases before Illinois abolished capital punishment, recognized that the evidence against Marcus was overwhelming, but also understood the importance of presenting a case that left no room for reasonable doubt. Chen assembled a team of assistant prosecutors, forensic experts, and victim advocates to prepare for what would become one of Chicago's most closely watched murder trials in recent years. The initial bond hearing drew significant media attention, with reporters filling the courtroom to capacity as Judge Theodore Morrison denied bond, ruling that Marcus posed an extreme danger to the community and a significant flight risk given the severity of the charges and strength of the evidence against him. The 7 victims of Marcus Williams's rampage left behind grieving families, shattered dreams, and communities struggling to comprehend such senseless violence. James Jackson, the 72-year-old Vietnam veteran who died trying to protect his family, had been planning to publish a memoir about his experiences during the war and his observations about how Chicago's South Side had changed over 5 decades. His incomplete manuscript was found on his home computer, a project he would never finish and stories that would never be fully told. Lorraine Jackson, whose 60th birthday celebration became her death scene, had been coordinating a neighborhood youth mentoring program that connected at-risk teenagers with positive adult role models, her vision of breaking cycles of violence and poverty dying with her. The couple's children, Darnell, Danielle, and Jerome, all left behind their own families and unfulfilled potential. Darnell's 2 young children, now fatherless, Danielle's fiancé left planning a funeral instead of a wedding, and Jerome's elderly mother-in-law losing the son-in-law who had cared for her after her own husband's death. Monica Jackson, Darnell's wife who was killed alongside her husband, had been a social worker specializing in family reunification, dedicating her career to keeping families together and helping them heal from trauma, only to become a victim of family violence herself. 19-year-old Tasha Williams, the youngest victim and the first to die, had been a straight-A student at Harold Washington College with plans to transfer to the University of Illinois to complete her nursing degree. Her grandmother, who had raised Tasha after her own mother died of cancer, was so devastated by the loss that she suffered a stroke 2 weeks after the funeral and never fully recovered. The ripple effects of Marcus Williams' violence extended far beyond the 7 people he murdered, destroying the emotional and psychological well-being of dozens of family members, friends, colleagues, and community members who had known and loved the victims. The legal proceedings moved through Chicago's criminal justice system with the deliberate pace required for a case of such magnitude and complexity. Marcus Williams, represented by public defender Catherine Reynolds due to his indigent status, entered a not guilty plea at his arraignment, though his defense strategy focused not on claiming innocence, but rather on avoiding the harshest possible sentence by arguing for concurrent rather than consecutive prison terms. Reynolds, an experienced capital defense attorney, who had opposed the death penalty throughout her career, now faced the challenge of defending a client whose crimes were indefensible, but who still deserved competent representation under the constitutional guarantee of counsel. Her pretrial motions focused on suppressing certain pieces of evidence and challenging the admissibility of Marcus's journal entries, arguing that they represented private thoughts rather than concrete plans and should not be used to establish premeditation. The trial of Marcus Williams began in Cook County Criminal Court on September 13, 2021, 8 months after the massacre that had shocked Chicago's South Side community. Judge Theodore Morrison presided over the proceedings, his reputation for strict courtroom management and fair but firm rulings, making him an ideal choice for a case that would attract intense media scrutiny and public attention. The jury selection process took 3 full days as attorneys on both sides questioned potential jurors about their ability to remain impartial despite extensive media coverage of the case, their views on mental health issues in criminal cases, and their emotional capacity to view disturbing evidence without being overwhelmed. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, representing a diverse cross-section of Chicago's population, with ages ranging from 25 to 67 and backgrounds spanning various professions and life experiences. Prosecutor David Chen's opening statement laid out the prosecution's case with clinical precision, walking the jury through Marcus Williams's progression from resentful family member to mass murderer. Chen displayed photographs of each victim, not their crime scene images but pictures from life showing them smiling, celebrating, and living the ordinary moments that Marcus had stolen from them forever. The prosecutor explained how Marcus had planned the attack meticulously, documenting his surveillance, acquiring weapons, and waiting for the perfect opportunity when all his intended targets would be gathered in one location. Chen played portions of the 911 call made by Shirley Matthews when she discovered the bodies, the audio of her panicked screaming and crying creating an emotional impact in the courtroom that left several jurors visibly shaken. The prosecutor's strategy focused on establishing premeditation through the documentary evidence found in Marcus's apartment while also emphasizing the defendant's complete lack of remorse or normal, emotional response to his actions. Defense attorney Catherine Reynolds faced the nearly impossible task of creating reasonable doubt or mitigating circumstances in a case where her client's guilt seemed obvious and his actions appeared indefensible. Her opening statement acknowledged the tragedy of 7 lives lost, but urged the jury to consider Marcus Williams's mental state and the psychological factors that had contributed to his violent breakdown. Reynolds argued that Marcus suffered from undiagnosed and untreated mental illness, specifically antisocial personality disorder and possible post-traumatic stress disorder, from growing up in one of Chicago's most violent neighborhoods, surrounded by gang activity and constant threats. She suggested that Marcus's capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct had been significantly impaired by these mental health issues combined with the humiliation and social isolation he experienced after his fraud conviction and the family testimony against him. Reynolds knew she could not win an acquittal, but hoped to persuade the jury that Marcus's mental state warranted consideration during sentencing, potentially resulting in concurrent rather than consecutive prison terms that would at least theoretically allow for the possibility of eventual release. The prosecution's case unfolded. Over 2 weeks of testimony from forensic experts, police investigators, medical examiners, and family members who survived the massacre by not attending the birthday celebration. Detective Maria Santos provided detailed testimony about the investigation, walking the jury through the evidence collection process and explaining how each piece contributed to identifying Marcus Williams as the perpetrator. Santos described the crime scene with professional detachment, but could not completely hide her emotional response when discussing the youngest victim, 19-year-old Tasha, whose promising life had been cut short before she had the opportunity to achieve her dreams. The detective presented the hit list found in Marcus's apartment, explaining how it demonstrated clear premeditation and intent, each victim's name written carefully alongside notes about their routines and Marcus's grievances against them. Forensic expert Dr. Lisa Park testified about the ballistics evidence linking the bullets recovered from the victims' bodies to the firearms registered to Marcus Williams. Dr. Park explained how microscopic striations on the bullets created unique signatures that could be matched to specific weapons with scientific certainty, displaying enlarged images of the comparison markings that showed perfect alignment between the crime scene bullets and test fires from Marcus's guns. The forensic testimony extended to gunshot residue analysis that placed Marcus at the scene handling firearms at the time of the murders. DNA evidence from the blood found in his mother's car that matched victim James Jackson, and digital forensics that tracked Marcus's cell phone to the crime scene location during the exact time frame when the massacre occurred. Each piece of scientific evidence built upon the previous testimony, creating an overwhelming factual foundation that left little room for the defense to challenge the prosecution's narrative of events. Medical examiner Dr. Kenneth Harris provided clinical but devastating testimony about each victim's cause of death, explaining the trajectories of bullets, the nature of wounds sustained, and the approximate sequence of the murders based on blood spatter patterns and body positions. Dr. Harris testified that several victims, including James Jackson and Darnell Jackson, had shown evidence of brief struggles before being killed, suggesting they had attempted to fight back or protect other family members. The medical examiner noted that Lorraine Jackson, the final victim, had what appeared to be defensive wounds on her hands, indicating she had raised her arms in a futile attempt to shield herself from her nephew's gunfire. This detail, perhaps more than any other, captured the horror of the massacre. A woman celebrating her 60th birthday surrounded by loved ones, pleading for her life with the young man she had helped raise, only to be executed at point-blank range without mercy or hesitation. Thus, an emotional centerpiece of the trial came when surviving family members testified about their relationships with the victims and the devastating impact of losing 7 relatives in a single night of violence. Patricia Williams, Marcus's mother, took the stand as a prosecution witness, her testimony representing the ultimate betrayal of her son, but also her recognition that justice demanded truth, regardless of family loyalty. Patricia described Marcus's deteriorating mental state after his fraud conviction, his increasing isolation and paranoid statements about the Jackson family conspiring against him, and her failed attempts to convince him to seek professional mental health treatment. She testified about the text message Marcus had sent claiming he was meeting friends for dinner on the night of the murders, a lie she had not questioned at the time, but now recognized as part of his deception. Patricia broke down crying on the stand when Prosecutor Chen asked whether she still loved her son, despite what he had done. Her answer, a whispered yes, that captured the impossible position she occupied as both the mother of a mass murderer and a woman, grieving for the family members her son had killed. Darnell Jackson's oldest daughter, 12-year-old Amara, provided victim impact testimony that left the courtroom in stunned silence. The young girl described her father as her best friend and role model, explaining how he had coached her basketball team, helped with homework every night, and always made time to listen to her problems and concerns. Amara testified that she no longer felt safe anywhere, because if her own cousin could murder her father at a family birthday party, then violence could strike any time and anywhere without warning. The child's testimony, delivered with remarkable composure considering her age and the trauma she had experienced, forced the jury to confront the human cost of Marcus Williams's actions beyond the 7 lives he had taken directly. The secondary victims, the children left fatherless, the spouses left widowed, the parents burying their children, all represented additional casualties of Marcus's narcissistic rage and inability to move past his perceived grievances. The defense called only 3 witnesses during their brief presentation, focusing their limited strategy on establishing Marcus Williams' mental health issues, rather than challenging the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Ronald Hayes testified about his evaluation of Marcus, diagnosing him with antisocial personality disorder, characterized by a pervasive pattern of disregard for the rights of others, lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and inability to form genuine emotional connections. Dr. Hayes explained that individuals with this disorder often experience narcissistic injury when their self-image is threatened, leading to rage responses disproportionate to the triggering event. The psychiatrist testified that Marcus's fraud conviction and the family testimony against him would have represented a profound threat to his self-concept, potentially triggering the violent response that culminated in the massacre. However, under cross-examination by Prosecutor Chen, Dr. Hayes acknowledged that antisocial personality disorder did not meet the legal standard for insanity or diminished capacity, and that Marcus had clearly understood that his actions were wrong, as evidenced by his attempts to suppress the gunshots, collect shell casings, and flee the scene. The prosecution's rebuttal focused on distinguishing the defense's mental health arguments by highlighting Marcus Williams's calculated planning and his complete understanding of the criminal nature of his actions. Prosecutor David Chen called forensic psychiatrist Dr. Amanda Richardson, who had also evaluated Marcus and reached different conclusions about his mental state at the time of the murders. Dr. Richardson testified that while Marcus did exhibit traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, this diagnosis in no way excused or diminished his criminal culpability. She explained that individuals with this disorder are fully capable of understanding right from wrong and controlling their behavior when motivated to do so. The fact that Marcus had planned the attack over several weeks, researched methods to avoid detection, attempted to clean up evidence at the crime scene, and showed no signs of psychotic thinking or delusional beliefs all demonstrated that he had acted with clear intent and full awareness of the consequences of his actions. Dr. Richardson walked the jury through Marcus's journal entries, highlighting passages that showed rational planning and goal-directed thinking, rather than the disorganized thoughts of someone experiencing a mental breakdown. She pointed to Marcus's decision to wait for Lorraine's birthday celebration when all his targets would be gathered in one location as evidence of strategic thinking and patience, incompatible with an impulsive crime of passion. The psychiatrist testified that Marcus's flat affect and lack of emotional response during his arrest and interrogation were consistent with psychopathic traits within antisocial personality disorder, specifically a profound deficit in empathy and emotional connection to others. This emotional emptiness, Dr. Richardson explained, made Marcus capable of committing extreme violence without the normal psychological barriers of guilt, remorse, or identification with his victim's suffering. When Prosecutor Chen asked whether Marcus's mental state should be considered a mitigating factor during sentencing, Dr. Richardson responded firmly that his psychiatric profile actually made him more dangerous, rather than less culpable, as individuals with these traits are highly likely to commit future violence if given the opportunity. The closing arguments began on the trial's 15th day, with Prosecutor David Chen delivering a passionate summation that wove together all the evidence presented over the previous weeks. Chen reminded the jury of the 7 victims, speaking each name slowly and deliberately while displaying their photographs on the courtroom monitors. James Jackson, Lorraine Jackson, Darnell Jackson, Monica Jackson, Danielle Jackson, Jerome Jackson, and Tasha Williams. The prosecutor walked through Marcus Williams's progression from resentful family member to methodical killer, emphasizing the documentary evidence that proved premeditation beyond any reasonable doubt. Chen held up the hit list found in Marcus's apartment, pointing out how each victim's name had been carefully written alongside notes about their schedules and Marcus's grievances. A literal roadmap to mass murder that Marcus had created with his own hand. The prosecutor displayed timeline graphics showing Marcus's movements on January 15th, from leaving his apartment with weapons concealed in a duffel bag to parking 3 blocks from the Jackson home, walking through the alley, and entering through the unlocked back door to begin his systematic execution of 7 people who had committed no crime other than testifying truthfully in court. Chen's closing argument reached its emotional crescendo as he described the final moments of each victim's life, forcing the jury to confront the human reality behind the clinical forensic evidence they had heard throughout the trial. He described 19-year-old Tasha Williams standing in the kitchen preparing coffee, shot from behind without warning. Her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse ended before she even realized she was in danger. The prosecutor recounted James Jackson's courageous but futile attempt to stop Marcus, the elderly veteran charging at his nephew despite being unarmed, trying to buy his family precious seconds to escape or hide. Chen described Danielle Jackson's desperate run toward the front door, shot in the back as she reached for freedom that was just feet away, dying within sight of the exit that might have saved her life. He spoke of Lorraine Jackson's final moments, sitting on her living room couch surrounded by the birthday decorations her family had lovingly arranged, pleading with Marcus to stop, to remember their shared history and family bonds, only to be shot in the forehead while begging for mercy that never came. This is not a case about mental illness or diminished capacity, Chen told the jury, his voice resonant with controlled anger. This is a case about evil, about a man so consumed by narcissistic rage over losing a court case that he murdered 7 people, including a teenager, to satisfy his wounded pride. Defense attorney Catherine Reynolds faced the daunting task of asking the jury for mercy for a client whose actions seemed to defy any possibility of mitigation or understanding. Her closing argument acknowledged the horror of the crimes, while emphasizing the humanity that even Marcus Williams possessed despite his profound psychological deficits. Reynolds reminded the jury that their role was not to determine guilt, which the evidence had established beyond question, but to understand the full context of how a human being could deteriorate to the point of committing such atrocities. She walked through Marcus's difficult childhood, raised by a single mother in one of Chicago's most violent neighborhoods, witnessing shootings and gang activity that traumatized him before he was old enough to process such experiences. Reynolds described the absence of Marcus's father, incarcerated when Marcus was 4 years old, leaving him without male guidance during critical developmental years when children form their understanding of relationships, conflict resolution, and emotional regulation. The defense attorney argued that Marcus's descent into criminality and violence was not inevitable, but rather the predictable result of untreated mental illness, combined with social neglect and the failure of various institutions to intervene before tragedy occurred. Reynolds pointed to the school counselors who had identified Marcus's behavioral problems, but lacked resources to provide meaningful intervention, the juvenile justice system that had cycled him through arrests and releases without addressing underlying psychological issues, and the adult criminal justice system that had convicted him of fraud, but offered no mental health treatment as part of his probation. She argued that Marcus Williams was himself a victim, not to excuse his crimes but to understand them in their full social and psychological context. Reynolds concluded by asking the jury to remember that even the most horrific crimes are committed by human beings, whose actions result from complex interactions of biology, environment, and circumstance. While justice demands accountability, she argued, it also requires acknowledging that no one is born a monster, and that society bears some responsibility when its most vulnerable members descend into violence after repeated failures to provide help when warning signs were evident. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 7 counts of first-degree murder. The forewoman, a 43-year-old elementary school teacher named Sharon Mitchell, later spoke to media about the deliberation process, explaining that the evidence of guilt had been so overwhelming that the jury had spent most of their time discussing the emotional impact of the case rather than debating the facts. Mitchell described how several jurors had wept while reviewing crime scene photographs during deliberations, struggling to reconcile the horror of what Marcus Williams had done with the defense's portrayal of him as a victim of circumstance and untreated mental illness. The jury had ultimately concluded that while Marcus's difficult upbringing and psychological issues provided context for his crimes, they did not diminish his moral and legal culpability for methodically planning and executing 7 people who had merely testified truthfully in a court proceeding. As the guilty verdicts were read in open court, Marcus Williams showed the same flat effect he had maintained throughout the trial, his expression unchanging as the clerk announced each conviction, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the courtroom walls, as if the proceedings were happening to someone else entirely. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks after the guilty verdicts, providing time for both prosecution and defense to prepare their arguments about what punishment Marcus Williams should receive for his crimes. Under Illinois law, first-degree murder carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years and a maximum of natural life imprisonment, with the judge having discretion to order sentences to run either concurrently, meaning simultaneously, or consecutively, meaning one after another. Prosecutor David Chen made clear his intention to seek the maximum possible sentence with all terms running consecutively, which would result in Marcus spending the rest of his life in prison with no possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing began with additional victim impact statements from family members who had not testified during the trial, providing Judge Theodore Morrison with a fuller picture of the devastating ripple effects of Marcus's violence throughout the extended family and community. Lorraine Jackson's younger sister, Margaret Davis, described how the massacre had destroyed her family's sense of safety and trust in the world. Margaret testified that her own children, Lorraine's nieces and nephews, now suffered from anxiety and nightmares, unable to attend family gatherings without experiencing panic attacks triggered by memories of the birthday celebration that had become a bloodbath. She described how the family had been forced to sell the Jackson home on South Indiana Avenue because no one could bear to enter the house where 7 relatives had been murdered, the building that had represented stability and continuity for 3 generations now serving only as a monument to violence and loss. Margaret spoke directly to Marcus Williams, asking him if he understood that his actions had destroyed not just 7 lives but dozens more, shattering the psychological well-being of everyone who had loved the victims and creating trauma that would echo through generations of family members who would grow up knowing that their grandfather, grandmother, aunts, uncles, and cousin had been massacred by someone who shared their blood. James Jackson's brother, retired Chicago police officer Samuel Jackson, provided testimony that carried particular weight, given his career in law enforcement. Samuel described his older brother as a man who had served his country in Vietnam, returned home to a nation that often treated veterans with disrespect, and built a meaningful life through hard work, family commitment, and community service. He testified about James's efforts to mentor young men in the neighborhood, including Marcus Williams, trying to provide the guidance and support that might steer them away from violence and toward productive lives. The bitter irony that James had died trying to protect his family from his own nephew, a young man he had attempted to help over many years, was not lost on Samuel, whose voice cracked with emotion as he described his brother's final courageous act. Samuel addressed Judge Morrison directly, arguing that Marcus Williams deserved no leniency, no consideration of mitigating factors, and no opportunity for eventual release. This defendant planned and executed the murder of 7 people with cold efficiency, Samuel stated, his decades of police experience evident in his clinical assessment. He showed no remorse before, during, or after his crimes. He represents a permanent danger to society and should be permanently removed from it. Monica Jackson's mother, 70-year-old Beatrice Henderson, required assistance walking to the witness stand, her health having deteriorated significantly in the months since her daughter's murder. Beatrice described Monica as a devoted social worker who had dedicated her career to reunifying families torn apart by abuse, neglect, and dysfunction, only to become a victim of family violence herself. She testified that Monica and Darnell had been planning to celebrate their 15th wedding anniversary with a trip to Hawaii, a vacation Monica had been excitedly planning for months, marking brochures and making lists of activities they would do together. All those dreams and plans ended on a January night when Marcus Williams decided that his wounded pride was more important than 7 human lives. Beatrice looked directly at Marcus as she concluded her statement, her elderly voice still carrying steel despite her grief. "You took my daughter from me," she said quietly. "You took her from her children who needed their mother. You took her from a world that needed her kindness and her commitment to helping others. I hope you spend every remaining day of your life in prison thinking about what you did, though I suspect you're incapable of genuine reflection or remorse. 19-year-old Tasha Williams's grandmother, Dorothy Williams, provided the most emotionally devastating testimony of the sentencing hearing. Dorothy, who was also Marcus's great-aunt, represented the impossible position of family members related to both the victims and the perpetrator, forced to balance grief for murdered loved ones with the complicated reality of blood connection to the killer. Dorothy described raising Tasha after her own daughter's death from cancer, pouring all her love and remaining energy into helping her granddaughter achieve the educational success and stable life that poverty and circumstance had denied to previous generations. She testified about Tasha's dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse, her straight-A grades at community college, her volunteer work at a local clinic where she assisted with free health screenings for uninsured families. All that potential, all that goodness, all that promise, Dorothy said through tears, destroyed because Marcus couldn't accept losing a court case. Tasha was 19 years old. She should have had 60, 70, maybe 80 more years of life ahead of her. She should have graduated from college, built a career, fallen in love, raised children of her own. Marcus took all of that away from her and from me because of his selfish rage. The defense called Marcus Williams' mother, Patricia Williams, as their sole witness during the sentencing hearing, a strategic decision designed to humanize Marcus by showing that even after everything he had done, his mother still loved him and believed he deserved some measure of compassion. Patricia's testimony represented the ultimate maternal sacrifice, standing before a courtroom filled with people who hated her son, acknowledging his crimes while trying to preserve some fragment of his humanity in the judge's eyes. She described Marcus as a sweet child who had been gradually destroyed by poverty, violence, absent fathers, and a mental health system that failed to recognize or treat his psychological problems until they manifested in the most horrible way imaginable. Patricia testified that she had begged Marcus to seek therapy after his fraud conviction, offering to pay for treatment herself despite her limited income. But he had refused, insisting that nothing was wrong with him and that the Jackson family was the problem. She described the text message Marcus had sent on the night of the murders, claiming he was meeting friends for dinner, and her later realization that her son had used her car to transport weapons to commit mass murder. Patricia Williams broke down completely as she addressed Judge Morrison, her testimony dissolving into sobs that made her words almost unintelligible. "He's still my son," she managed to say through tears. "I know what he did was unforgivable. I know 7 people are dead because of him. I know families are destroyed and children are traumatized. But he's still my son, and I still love him, and I'm asking you to please show him some mercy." Patricia's testimony backfired spectacularly when prosecutor David Chen, during cross-examination, asked her a series of pointed questions about Marcus's behavior in the weeks before the murders. Chen forced Patricia to acknowledge that Marcus had made increasingly violent and threatening statements about the Jackson family, that she had recognized his mental state was deteriorating dangerously, but that she had not contacted police or mental health authorities because she didn't want to get her son in trouble. The prosecutor suggested that Patricia's failure to intervene when she knew Marcus posed a danger made her partially responsible for the tragedy that followed. A harsh accusation that left Patricia speechless on the witness stand and undermined whatever sympathy her maternal devotion might have generated with the judge. Defense attorney Catherine Reynolds made her final argument for leniency during sentencing, acknowledging that the crimes Marcus Williams had committed were horrific, but arguing that consecutive life sentences would serve no purpose beyond pure retribution. Reynolds pointed out that Marcus was 29 years old at the time of the murders, meaning even a single life sentence would likely keep him incarcerated until his death, given the realities of the Illinois prison system and the unlikelihood of parole for someone convicted of multiple murders. She argued that ordering consecutive rather than concurrent sentences was purely symbolic, a way of expressing society's rage at Marcus's crimes, but not meaningfully different in practical effect from concurrent terms that would still keep him imprisoned for life. Reynolds urged Judge Morrison to consider that even the most damaged individuals retain some spark of humanity worth preserving, and that the justice system's purpose should include rehabilitation and hope alongside punishment and incapacitation. She concluded with a quote from Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy about the importance of maintaining prisoners' dignity. "The Eighth Amendment requires that we respect the human attributes, even of those who have committed serious crimes. Prosecutor David Chen's sentencing argument rejected the defense's appeals to mercy and rehabilitation, arguing that Marcus Williams had permanently forfeited any claim to compassionate treatment through the sheer magnitude and cruelty of his crimes. Chen methodically reviewed the evidence of premeditation, displaying once again the hit list, surveillance photos, and journal entries that documented Marcus's planning over multiple weeks. He emphasized Marcus's complete lack of remorse, pointing out that throughout the trial and sentencing hearing, Marcus had shown no emotional response to testimony about his victim's suffering, no acknowledgement of responsibility, and no indication that he understood or cared about the pain he had caused. The prosecutor argued that consecutive sentences were essential to honor each victim individually, ensuring that the legal system recognized that Marcus had not committed one crime, but 7 distinct murders, each representing the deliberate decision to end a human life. Chen displayed photographs of all 7 victims on the courtroom monitors as he spoke their names. James Jackson, 72 years old, Vietnam veteran, murdered while trying to protect his family. Lorraine Jackson, 60 years old, teacher's aide and community volunteer, murdered at her own birthday celebration. Darnell Jackson, 38 years old, accountant and father of 2, murdered for reporting identity theft. Monica Jackson, 36 years old, social worker dedicated to helping families, murdered alongside her husband. Danielle Jackson, 38 years old, murdered while trying to escape to safety. Jerome Jackson, 34 years old, murdered defending his family. Tasha Williams, 19 years old, nursing student with her whole life ahead of her, murdered first because she happened to be in the kitchen when Marcus began his rampage. Chen's voice rose with controlled passion as he approached his conclusion, his words carrying the weight of the prosecution's moral certainty about the justice Marcus Williams deserved. Your Honor, this defendant methodically planned and executed 7 people to satisfy his narcissistic rage over a court case he lost because of his own criminal behavior. He showed no mercy to his victims, no hesitation when faced with their pleas for their lives, and no remorse afterward. The law allows for consecutive sentences in precisely this type of case where a defendant commits multiple distinct acts of murder as part of a calculated plan. Justice for James, Lorraine, Darnell, Monica, Danielle, Jerome, and Tasha demands that each of their lives be acknowledged individually through separate sentences. We ask that the court impose 7 consecutive terms of natural life imprisonment, ensuring that Marcus Williams never again has the opportunity to harm another human being. Judge Theodore Morrison took 20 minutes to review his notes before announcing the sentence that would conclude the legal proceedings against Marcus Williams. The judge began by addressing the courtroom, acknowledging the extraordinary pain and loss represented by the 7 victims and their surviving families. Morrison stated that in his 23 years on the bench, he had presided over numerous murder trials, but none that combined such meticulous planning with such profound betrayal of family bonds and complete absence of mitigating factors. The judge reviewed the evidence of premeditation, noting that Marcus had not acted impulsively in a moment of passion, but had instead methodically prepared for weeks to commit mass murder at a family celebration. Morrison addressed the defense's mental health arguments, stating that while he accepted that Marcus suffered from antisocial personality disorder, this diagnosis did not excuse his crimes or diminish his culpability, as he clearly understood right from wrong and had acted with deliberate intent to kill specific individuals for specific reasons. Judge Morrison then spoke directly to Marcus Williams, who maintained his characteristic flat effect, even as the judge delivered words that would define the remainder of his life. Mr. Williams, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of 7 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence presented at trial showed beyond any doubt that you planned and executed these murders to punish family members who had testified truthfully against you in court. You showed no mercy to your victims, several of whom pleaded for their lives. You showed no remorse afterward, attempting only to evade responsibility rather than acknowledge the magnitude of your crimes. You have shown no remorse during these proceedings, maintaining the same emotionally detached demeanor while family members describe the devastation you caused. This court must impose a sentence that reflects the severity of your crimes, acknowledges each victim individually, and ensures that you never again pose a danger to society. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Judge Morrison pronounced the sentence that would make headlines across Chicago and establish precedent for future mass murder cases in Illinois. Marcus Deshaun Williams for the first-degree murder of James Jackson. This court sentences you to natural life imprisonment without possibility of parole. For the first-degree murder of Lorraine Jackson, this court sentences you to natural life imprisonment without possibility of parole, to run consecutive to the previous sentence. For the first-degree murder of Darnell Jackson, this court sentences you to natural life imprisonment without possibility of parole, to run consecutive to the previous sentences. For the first-degree murder of Monica Jackson, this court sentences you to natural life imprisonment without possibility of parole, to run consecutive to the previous sentences. For the first-degree murder of Danielle Jackson, this court sentences you to natural life imprisonment without possibility of parole, to run consecutive to the previous sentences. For the first-degree murder of Jerome Jackson, this court sentences you to natural life imprisonment without possibility of parole, to run consecutive to the previous sentences. For the first-degree murder of Tasha Williams, this court sentences you to natural life imprisonment without possibility of parole, to run consecutive to all previous sentences. Judge Morrison paused, allowing the weight of 7 consecutive life sentences to settle over the courtroom before delivering his final statement. Mr. Williams, while Illinois does not technically allow for sentences beyond natural life, the consecutive nature of these 7 life terms serves an important symbolic purpose. Each sentence represents recognition of an individual human life that you deliberately ended. The total aggregate term, which would theoretically equal 540 years if each life term were calculated as the average human lifespan of 77 years, reflects the magnitude of your crimes. You destroyed 7 lives, shattered countless others, and demonstrated through your complete lack of remorse that you represent a permanent danger to society. You will spend every remaining day of your life in maximum security prison, and you will never be released. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in subdued reactions as Judge Morrison's gavel struck, finalizing the sentence that would keep Marcus Williams imprisoned until his death. Several family members embraced, crying tears that mixed grief for their lost loved ones with relief that the legal process had concluded and justice had been served. Patricia Williams sat alone on the defense side of the gallery, her face buried in her hands, mourning both the 7 relatives her son had murdered and the son she had now lost to the prison system forever. Marcus Williams showed no visible reaction to the sentence, his expression remaining blank as sheriff's deputies approached to escort him from the courtroom. As he was led away, he turned briefly to look at his mother, their eyes meeting for a moment before he was taken through the door that would lead back to Cook County Jail and then to his permanent placement in Illinois' maximum security prison system. The aftermath of the sentencing brought a complex mixture of closure and ongoing grief to the families affected by Marcus Williams' crimes. Media coverage of the 540-year sentence sparked national discussions about appropriate punishment for mass murder in states that had abolished the death penalty, with legal scholars debating whether consecutive life sentences served any purpose beyond symbolic recognition of multiple victims. Some argued that once a defendant received 1 life without parole sentence, additional consecutive terms were legally meaningless, since the person would obviously die in prison regardless. Others contended that separate sentences for each victim were essential to maintaining the principle that every human life has individual value and that legal recognition of multiple murders should reflect the distinct harm caused by each killing rather than treating mass murder as a single crime with multiple casualties. The surviving family members attempted to rebuild their lives in the shadow of unimaginable loss, finding different paths toward healing and meaning-making in the aftermath of tragedy. Darnell Jackson's 2 children, who were 9 and 11 at the time of the murders, entered long-term therapy to process the trauma of losing their father and witnessing their family torn apart by violence. Their grandmother, Darnell's mother, Sharon Jackson, became their primary caregiver, taking early retirement from her teaching position to provide stability and support during their most vulnerable years. Sharon established a college scholarship fund in Darnell and Monica's names, ensuring that their legacy would include helping other young people achieve educational success despite financial obstacles. The scholarship committee prioritized applicants who had experienced family trauma or violence, recognizing that healing often came through finding purpose and creating meaning from senseless loss. Tasha Williams' grandmother, Dorothy, channeled her grief into advocacy work, focused on improving mental health services in Chicago's underserved communities. Dorothy argued that while Marcus Williams deserved punishment for his crimes, the tragedy might have been prevented if appropriate mental health intervention had occurred earlier in his life, when warning signs were evident. She worked with local legislators to secure funding for expanded school-based mental health screening and intervention programs, hoping to identify troubled youth before their problems escalated into violence. Dorothy spoke frequently at community forums about her dual losses, both her granddaughter murdered by her great-nephew and the great-nephew whose untreated mental illness had destroyed 2 branches of her family tree. Her message emphasized that preventing violence required addressing root causes including poverty, trauma, absent parents, and inadequate access to mental health care, while still maintaining that individuals who committed crimes bore full responsibility for their choices regardless of difficult circumstances. The Bronzeville neighborhood where the Jackson family had lived for 3 generations struggled to process the massacre that had occurred in their midst, a crime that felt different from the gang-related shootings and drug violence that plagued many Chicago communities. The family annihilation represented a betrayal of the bonds that held communities together, the trust that allowed families to gather in celebration without fear that their own relatives might turn into murderers. The Jackson home on South Indiana Avenue remained empty for months after the murders. The property eventually sold at a significant loss to investors who planned to renovate and resell, without disclosing the building's horrific history. Neighbors who had known the Jackson family for decades erected a memorial in a nearby park, 7 trees planted in a circle with a plaque bearing each victim's name and the dates of their birth and death. The memorial became a gathering place for residents seeking to remember the victims as living people, rather than statistics in Chicago's gun violence epidemic. Marcus Williams adjusted to life in Menard Correctional Center, Illinois' maximum security prison located in southern Illinois far from Chicago and the communities affected by his crimes. Prison officials classified Marcus as a model inmate who caused no disciplinary problems, followed rules precisely, and maintained the same emotionally detached demeanor he had shown throughout his trial. Psychologists who evaluated Marcus periodically noted that he demonstrated no progress toward developing empathy, accepting responsibility, or showing genuine remorse for his actions. His conversations with mental health staff revealed a man who intellectually understood that society viewed his crimes as horrific, but who personally felt no emotional connection to the suffering he had caused. Marcus spent his time in prison reading, watching television, and occasionally corresponding with his mother, Patricia, who visited monthly despite the 4-hour drive and the emotional toll of seeing her son in maximum security confinement. His letters home never mentioned the murders or his victims, instead focusing on mundane details of prison routine and complaints about food quality or other inmates' behavior, as if he were serving time for a minor offense rather than 7 murders. The legal community examined the Marcus Williams case as a potential precedent for future sentencing in mass murder cases, particularly regarding the symbolic significance of consecutive life sentences. The Illinois Appellate Court upheld Marcus's convictions and sentence in a unanimous decision that rejected his attorneys' arguments that consecutive life terms violated constitutional prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment. The appellate court ruled that while consecutive life sentences might be mathematically redundant, since the defendant would die in prison after serving only one such term, they served important expressive and symbolic purposes by recognizing each victim as an individual whose death warranted separate legal acknowledgement. The decision stated, when a defendant commits multiple murders as distinct acts of violence against separate victims, consecutive sentences properly reflect that the defendant made separate decisions to end multiple lives. The law recognizes the principle that every human life has individual value, and our sentencing practices must reflect this fundamental truth. 5 years after the massacre, Chicago journalist Michael Torres published Blood Birthday: The Marcus Williams Family Massacre, a comprehensive examination of the case that became a regional bestseller and sparked renewed discussion about family violence, mental health, and the limits of criminal justice. Torres's reporting revealed previously unknown details about Marcus's childhood and adolescence, including incidents of cruelty to animals that had been witnessed but never reported to authorities, a pattern of manipulation and lying that had characterized his relationship since elementary school, and multiple instances where teachers, counselors, and juvenile justice officials had identified him as concerning, but lacked resources or legal authority to mandate treatment. The book raised uncomfortable questions about society's collective failure to intervene in Marcus Williams's development, while maintaining that this failure in no way excused or diminished his personal responsibility for choosing to commit 7 murders in revenge for losing a court case. Torres's investigation also uncovered information about the Jackson family's attempts to maintain connection with Marcus, despite his increasingly problematic behavior. Their repeated efforts to include him in family gatherings even after his fraud conviction, and their genuine shock that he was capable of such extreme violence. James Jackson's diary, recovered from his home office, contained entries describing his concerns about Marcus, but also his belief that no one was beyond redemption if given sufficient support and guidance. One entry written just 3 months before the murders read, "Talked with Marcus today. He's still so angry about the court case. Tried to explain that Darnell had no choice about reporting the identity theft. That family sometimes means holding each other accountable. Marcus wouldn't hear it. Says we all betrayed him. I'm worried about where his head is at. But I have to believe he'll eventually work through this anger and find peace. He's family. We don't give up on family." The tragic irony of James Jackson's commitment to familial loyalty, even toward a nephew who would ultimately murder him, illustrated the profound betrayal at the heart of the case. The 7th anniversary of the massacre brought together surviving family members for a private memorial service at the park where the 7 trees had been planted. The gathering included Darnell and Monica's children, now teenagers navigating the complicated process of building identities separate from the trauma that defined their early lives. Danielle Jackson's former fiancé, who had eventually remarried but named his daughter Danielle in honor of the woman he had planned to marry, spoke about the ongoing challenge of maintaining memories of loved ones while not being consumed by the violence that took them. Jerome Jackson's widow, who had struggled with depression and PTSD for years after the murders, shared her journey toward healing through therapy, medication, and the gradual acceptance that she could honor her husband's memory by living fully rather than remaining frozen in grief. Patricia Williams attended the memorial service by invitation from some family members who recognized that she too had lost loved ones that night, though her presence remained controversial and painful for many who struggled to separate their anger at Marcus from their relationship with his mother. The Marcus Williams case left an indelible mark on Chicago's legal landscape and collective consciousness, serving as a grim reminder that the most dangerous violence often comes from within families rather than from strangers. The 540-year sentence became a reference point in subsequent Illinois cases involving multiple murders, with prosecutors regularly citing the Williams precedent when arguing for consecutive life terms. Mental health advocates used the case to highlight the need for early intervention and accessible treatment, while acknowledging the uncomfortable reality that many individuals with similar psychiatric profiles and difficult backgrounds never commit violence, suggesting that personal responsibility and individual choice remain central to understanding criminal behavior, regardless of contributing environmental or psychological factors. The 7 victims, James, Lorraine, Darnell, Monica, Danielle, Jerome, and Tasha, were remembered not primarily as murder victims but as individuals who had lived meaningful lives defined by love, work, community service, and family commitment before Marcus Williams decided that his wounded pride justified ending their existence. As Marcus Williams settled into the routine of life imprisonment, approaching his mid-30s in a maximum security cell where he would remain until his death, the families he had destroyed continued the difficult work of building new lives from the rubble of the old. The empty chair at holiday gatherings, the missing voices during family phone calls, the grandchildren who would never meet their grandparents, the potential unfulfilled because lives were cut short. All these absences marked the permanent damage Marcus had inflicted in his 6-minute rampage through the Jackson home on that January night. Judge Morrison's sentence of 540 years, impossible to serve in any literal sense but powerful in its symbolic recognition of 7 distinct lives deliberately ended, stood as the justice system's attempt to acknowledge through law what could never be restored through punishment: the irreplaceable value of each human being whose life had been stolen by narcissistic rage masquerading as grievance. The case closed, the appeals exhausted, the sentence final. Marcus Williams would spend every remaining day in prison, while those who survived him spent their remaining days learning to live with loss that would never completely heal, but might, with time and grace, become bearable enough to allow for moments of joy, peace, and meaning in lives forever shadowed by violence and grief.